Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Leslie Kean, investigative reporter and writer, and been around this topic for quite a while. And I want to thank the Reddit community for putting on this event. They're absolutely amazing, and we've had technical issues, but we got them all sorted out. And we're just so excited to jump into conversations and take your questions with these two amazing people. Jacques Vallee and Jeff Kripal are people that I consider to be friends as well as mentors. I have learned so much from them. They've influenced my work profoundly and helped me realize how much I don't understand about this topic. But I'm just so happy to have them here today. And I'm not going to go into who they are because I think everybody knows that. They have both known each other for a long time. And one of the interesting connections I think that they have, which I find really meaningful, is that Jacques Kripal wrote about Jacques in his book Authors of the Impossible, which I believe came out in 2010. It was a while ago. And after that book came out, Jacques approached Jeff about wanting to find a place to put his archives, because obviously Jacques has a huge collection of very important papers and documents from his career. And it was that request that started the Archives of the Impossible at Rice. I mean, if Jacques had never approached Jeff about where can I put my papers, there would be no Archives of the Impossible. And I'm a huge fan of the Archives of the Impossible and a supporter of it. And so I just think that's a wonderful kind of way that these two amazing people have intersected. And there's a lot of other ways as well. But I'm so grateful to both of them. And we're going to start today with Jacques is going to tell us about a new paper that he has co-authored that is just coming out now in a really important journal that is not a UFO journal. And it has to do with a case in the Condon Committee that was mentioned as not solved by the Condon Committee, which he has revisited and reinvestigated and brought forward new data about. So we're going to begin. Jacques, if you'd like to just jump in and make this announcement and tell us about your new paper, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Leslie. Well, the case is going to be published in this review, which is the major astronautics review in the world today. It's an international journal, and it publishes, so far, has published only papers and research on aerospace. And it's about to, because the editors have taken notice of everything we're talking about, of this phenomenon going on for so many years. And our paper is part of a special issue, and there will be other special issues on UFOs, the UFO phenomenon specifically, from a scientific and intellectual point of view. In the process, there are a number of things that we believe that we're going to have to let go. We know, for example, that Blue Book was a sham, that all the data was classified anyway, and that it was just a way of turning attention of the public away from what was happening. We know that the Condon Report of the University of Colorado was essentially a joke, even though it was blessed by the Academy of Sciences. But, the Air Force wanted to get rid of the problem. And we know that UFOs are real objects with lights that interfere with aircraft, and they are about the size of a truck. Some of them are a lot smaller, and they just go around and interfere with aircraft. Most of that is partially true and profoundly wrong. Blue Book was not a sham. Blue Book was a secondary effort of the Air Force to get a number of cases that didn't necessarily come from their own instrumentation. But for example, the Navy reported to Project Blue Book on things that ships at sea had observed. So if you pay attention, you go through the Air Force files, you'll find 150 cases from the US Navy. And there are a lot of those things are important. The Condon Report was superficial. It was a political scheme so that the Air Force could be free of the problem. But that leaves the question of what UFOs are. Back in 1967, people tell me, Jacques, you deal with all those old cases because you're not up on what's coming up now, okay? Because you've been around such a long time, which is true. But there are things that have been going on a long time that we haven't paid attention to, and they come up to the modern research. And this case is one of them. This happened in 1966. I heard of it in 1967 because Dr. Hynek and I had convinced the Air Force to let me look at their new reports month by month to redo the statistics. So I was looking at the statistics of the last quarter of 1966, and I found this case, and I thought the case was really important. And since the Condon Committee was starting work at the University of Colorado, I called Dr. Hynek, I showed him the case, and I said, this is something we should submit to Dr. Condon because there are some very specific things which he should be interested in. And in fact, he was. And in fact, if you read the Condon Report, which you haven't read, shame on you, you've read the first 50 pages or so. Most people have only read the introduction and the blessing from the academy. But there is a huge appendix with cases, including one-third of the cases that were marked unidentified by the Condon Committee. This is one of them. They studied the case. There's 4 pages in that big book. There are 4 pages about that one case. The case is in Arkansas. Actually, the main witness is a university professor named Dr. Galloway, who was just driving home with his wife and 2 little kids. He was in his early 30s. He's driving back through a forest. It's raining. It's night. He sees a light, a big light, a white light that changes color occasionally and flashes very intensely. Being a professor of nuclear physics, he does something that I envy people who can do that. He measures the intensity of that light by comparing it to the intensity of the headlights of his car. He's driving at night in the rain through a forest. He sees the point where the light from the object washes out his headlights. He knows the power of his car headlights, and he does a simple calculation. And he comes up with a very, very large intensity figure. He drives then through that forest and gets out of there, but he has observed it at 2 different points, and he thinks the Air Force should know about this, so he writes the Air Force report. The Air Force report is in my desk with a whole bunch of reports. And that's the point where I call Dr. Hynek and I say, we should submit this to Dr. Condon. Dr. Condon and his team did an extensive study of that case. They sent 2 of their PhDs in physics there to meet with the witness. They interviewed the Air Force. The Air Force cooperated completely. Project Blue Book had said, well, this is just a light, this is unidentified light, and they brushed it off. Well, it wasn't just any kind of light at that kind of intensity in the middle of nowhere. So this is a forest where you have just one little road going through it. The nearest railway is 7 miles away, and it has been unused for a long time. And so now you start making some calculations on the intensity. And remember, Dr. Condon was at Trinity, at the time of the first nuclear explosion. He worked with Dr. Oppenheimer. He's an atomic physicist. And here he has a witness who is a professor of atomic physics. So he completely respects the case and respects that measurement. He redoes the measurements, and he finds 900 megawatts. The witness had calculated it and had found about half of that. 900 megawatts is the energy of a nuclear power plant. That's why, I thought that this was an important case, because if you turn on TV and you see what's reported to Congress and all the things in the files and so on, I mean, the objects have lights, but, it's just another light. And the light is interesting. But here we're dealing with something which is completely out of the range of what people think of as UFOs. So it deserves to be studied a little bit more. The Condon people sent some missions from a branch of the Air Force to take infrared pictures at night over that forest to try to find the exact place. They never found the exact place. Our paper is in, again, Frontiers of Aerospace Sciences, and we have the testimony of the main witness. We have photographs of the places, photographs of similar trees to those that were there. And we have all the records from 2 weather stations that were within 20 or 30 miles of that place. These are the things that you're not getting when you turn on the TV and somebody reports something to Congress. You don't have the data, and nobody bothers to ask the data. Who are the witnesses? How do they know it's unusual? Has there been an investigation at the spot? Have they found the exact spot? What is at the exact spot? And what else could it be? And so on. So that's what we did. The witnesses went back after the publication of Condon's book, after his report to the Academy of Sciences, after the Academy of Sciences had blessed the fact that there was really nothing important about UFOs, which killed the research for 9 years. But they went back to the site after that. They found the site. At the site, they found that the trees were burned. This was a clearing, not a very large clearing, but this was a clearing with pine trees all around, and the pine trees were burned. So they sent the bark to different labs, mostly Defense Department labs, to be analyzed. They got the samples of the bark, they got them back with no answer. Nobody had bothered to look at it, or they did, and they threw it away. So I asked at that point, I was in correspondence with the witness and with one of his colleagues who was also a professor of physics, who had gone back to the site, and by the way, interviewed people in the whole area who had seen lights, but of course had not reported them. There were 5 cases around that time that they identified. 2 of them were contemporary to what they had seen. That those were of huge lights in the sky that came to the ground. So this was not a unique observation, as Professor Condon had assumed. So now we have this part of a tree which is severely burned on one side and not on the other. This is not burned. This has been blackened in certain ways by intense radiation. So now we have another witness, which is a tree. And the question that I posed to my friends in French science was, what can we do now that technology has advanced to the point where we can analyze that tree? What could we do to bring new data, new estimates of the radiation, to the whole case? And that's the case that we just published. and it's now, it's available, and it's going to be in that review. In our study, we found, depending on certain hypotheses, and again, we're going to keep working on this, but if we find 600 megawatts, which would be between Dr. Galloway and Dr. Condon's estimates, 3,000 megawatts or 10,000 megawatts. There have been a few other cases that have been studied in the literature by physicists who are interested in UFOs that have reported on intensities and energies in that range, but there are not more than 2 or 3. So this case is unique, and this case is important, and we certainly are going to continue the research. The team is a French team of physicists, and we'll continue to work obviously with colleagues in the US as well.
Thank you, Jacques. Yeah, I mean, and I think there's a link, or maybe you've already put it on the screen, so everybody who can go to the paper and read it. There it is again. I guess there's also a link underneath I'm sure underneath on the YouTube data thing, in case you don't want to do it that way. So Jacques, it's just really exciting, and I'm so grateful for you having done this work. And
Well, it shows that all cases are important because technology evolves, and we now have ways of, obviously, this piece of bark, we're going to look inside, and we think that there are layers of intensity recorded in there. I mean, that tree was there, and that tree recorded everything.
And you haven't completed that yet, right? It's not part of there's still work to be done on the bark, even though.
Yes. We've refrained from going beyond that because when we realized what we had, we think we need to bring in experts, including French, American experts who know about trees and intensity, radiation, and so on. All of that is known, because of the atomic bomb. I mean, what is the effect of atomic radiation, nuclear radiation on living tissue? This is living tissue. So we need to bring in experts. The 3 of us, actually, the 4 of us, essentially know about physics and know about computing and radiation, but we are not experts on the effect of radiation on living tissue.
And will you, or did you already also, since you know the location, have you looked at the soil as well, or is it too long ago for anything to remain in the soil?
It's too long ago. That forest has been harvested partially. It's now owned by Weyerhaeuser, and they've harvested the trees there and replanted it. So, it would be useless to go there.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that. So I'm just gonna shift over to Jeff, and then we'll take some of the Reddit questions. Jeff's going to just address the broader question of the role of UAP in religions, basically, in a broad global sense, and that'll sort of set the context for everything else that might follow from him. So Jeff, jump in.
So I'm struck by Jacques' story and Dr. Condon's relationship to Oppenheimer and the whole nuclear question. The UFO, or now the UAP question, can really be divided between a kind of post-atomic era and a pre-atomic era, a prehistory and a post-history, as it were. And the UFO, of course, as an acronym, was coined in the 50s, as by the Air Force in a Cold War context. And a lot of this conversation, I think, is a response to the nuclear weapon and to nuclear energy, including this particular case, obviously, that Jacques is speaking about. So that's the first thing I notice. The thing that strikes me about the UFO or the UAP phenomenon in general is its effects on human beings, and in particular their religious experiences, or their paranormal, or their impossible experiences in response to these craft or these objects or these presences. That's been going on way before 1947. I mean, that's as far back as we can see. My joke is the gods have always been coming from the sky. That's where they come from. And I want to recognize that we're in a different situation. There's a different kind of urgency. There's a different kind of political context today. But the issues of ontological shock and even disclosure. Disclosure is a perfect translation of the Greek apocalypse, by the way, which essentially literally means disclosure. So I mean, we've been talking about this. Our ancestors have been talking and experiencing this for literally millennia. And, so my response always as a historian of religions when it comes to things like disclosure, which is a lot of the Reddit questions, is one of historical caution. People have been talking about disclosure for a long time. And I recognize I don't want to assume our present worldview and feed it back into the past, but I also don't want to assume a past worldview and feed it into the present, which is, I think, what a lot of popular culture does. They just assume the present worldview, whether it's a religious worldview or a scientific worldview, and then they force fit it into all these cases. And my inclination is always to let the cases stand, and let's listen to the cases, and let's alter our worldview according to the cases. Let's not force fit or reduce the cases into our worldview. I suppose that's the more general comment I want to make.
Thank you for that. I guess we can just go on to a question to get the Reddit questions going here. So we have a question here for Jeff. This is from our aliens, and the person is you pixelated. Dr. Kripal, a new crop circle was seen last week in Suttonbury, England. What is the metaphysical significance of crop circles for humanity?
That's a tough one. I just did a podcast on crop circles, by the way, and my suspicion with a lot of crop circles is that they look too good. They're too good to be true. That doesn't mean they're faked or functions of fraud like Dave and Doug, which is where people go immediately. I'm not suggesting that, but I am suspicious of crop circles. And I know Jacques is as well. I know Jacques has written about them. But they're just too good. I mean, my joke is, where do you draw the line? And I always say crop circles. And, it's a joke, but it's also, it's a kind of honest joke that's essentially where I do. Because I do think they're human. I don't think we know how they're made. I suspect some kind of aerial phenomenon, some kind of technology, but I don't know.
Do you want to add something to that, Jacques?
I think we do know how they are made. They are made in two ways. They are made by people who like to create a sense of astonishment in people. So they go out at night and they flatten, they create and I've met them. I met them one time at a conference in Switzerland, and I said, but how can you, and they were explaining how they did it. And I said, how can you do something like that? I mean, these pictures are not real. And they say, that's art. When you look at the Mona Lisa, that's not a woman. Somebody took some paint and painted a woman, but that's not the woman. And we do the same thing. We're artists, and we're delighted to see the effect it has on people, the astonishment, the sense of wonder that we create by flattening, cornfields. There is another side. One time in the 70s or early 80s, I was at a conference at Oxford in England, and talking about how you approach UFOs from the scientific point of view. And one young man stopped me after the lecture and said, I'm a professor of physics here at Oxford, But on weekends, I'm a glider pilot. I like to, go out. The thermals around that whole area where crop circles are reported, the thermals are very interesting for pilots, for glider pilots. So I take, my plane and I take off and I go up in those thermals, and I enjoy doing that. And one time, recently, I know who he is. He's published books on physics and so on. I saw something close to my airplane where that was like a mirror where I could see my airplane. I could see myself in it. And I was at 3,000 feet, and that shouldn't happen at 3,000 feet. I shouldn't have a mirror in front of me. So I thought that was strange, and I wanted to know the shape of it. So I started flying around it, and it was a cylinder, a mirror, complete mirror, that was reflected the sky, the clouds, the fields, everything else. And it was, about 20 feet high and maybe 5 or 6 feet in diameter. And it was floating about, over cornfields. Well, at that point, I mean, suppose that you want to calibrate a beam from the sky at an exquisite precision. You need to measure something on the ground. The best thing, if you can measure it to the diameter of a stalk of wheat, you would get a very, very precise physical measurement. Why you would want to do that is not something that I want to get into. But these experiments, and I verified it with specialists, these experiments have been going on since the early 70s, and they still go on. Now, why would you want to do that, and how would you do that? Well, people have said you could do that from a satellite. You could not do it with a satellite. You're too far. The beam would be diffused and so on. What kind of a beam? Well, a proton beam or a laser beam. Well, a laser beam you would see, okay? So it's probably a combination of two beams. There is an energy beam that's going to couple into the plant. And then there is a guiding beam that keeps it very parallel and very focused. Okay. And I've discussed that with Eric Davis and with other physicists in our team. And, there are different ways to do that. But if you were at 3,000 feet, you're pretty close. You can do that. And then you can measure you can go back to the field afterwards on weekend with your kids, and you can cut some of the things, and you can measure the amount of energy that has gone into the. Why do we know that's the case? Well, the artists, I said, how do you make this? And they say, well, we have a stick and we push the stick and it cuts the wheat. Well, when you do that, it cuts the wheat between the nodes, because the nodes are really hard, and then you can break the wheat. The real ones, that by the way are made in minutes, people have seen them being made. They see, something going on in the field, and there is a crop circle, and they don't know where it came from. Okay? The nodes are exploded. And again, it's a question of energy. You're coupling energy into a plant. And of course, most of the energy is going to be dissipated in the nodes. And the nodes are fibers, and those fibers will explode, and then the wheat will be bent. It's not bent mechanically like the artist going there with a 2x4. Okay, you don't use a 2x4. You can use just a very neat little beam that we can tell you the frequency. We can tell you everything. Those experiments have been done. Teams from France and teams from the US have gone back and cut some wheat from those fields and have subjected them to a number of experiments to see how you blow up the nodes. And what happens is you flatten the wheat. So that explains a lot of it. It also explains the patterns and so on. Because now let's look at, those amazing pictures. The Mandelbrot set, okay, which is mathematically very beautiful and so on. Mandelbrot published that in the 50s. Okay, I mean, all those pictures we can make. We already know that. Okay, this has nothing to do with what would be relevant, to Jeff in terms of the history of religion, in terms of a manifestation from a higher level. When God manifests something, or when the Virgin Mary appears, that's not common physics. It's something else, which is what gets our attention. I think that this is not just a theory, because the experiments have been redone. I think that you would not be able to observe the device that does that. The only reason I know about that is that this glider pilot, did the experiment. It was a professor of physics. He was intrigued by why there was a mirror image of him in the middle of the sky, and he did that. And he thought it was he thought it was genius, and I think it's genius. Now, why you would want to do that? Well, there are a number of situations where, the military might want to do something like that. One of them that we thought about was, suppose that somebody has a stored nuclear bomb somewhere, you know, material that you want to destroy, but or they have viruses stored in a lab somewhere that in connection with weapons using viruses. And you would like to destroy that laboratory. If you drop a bomb with it, you're dispersing viruses all over the country and then all over the world. So what you want to do is fuse it locally, fuse the building. If you fuse the building, you have to do that with very high precision, and you have to do it with a device that's not going to be observed very easily, a low observable device that contains the kind of beam that will fuse a building with everything in it. I think that's one good hypothesis for what the crop circles are. Now, I'm open to other hypotheses, and so are my friends. But don't ignore the fact.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Jacques. I was just going to the next question.
How many questions like that do you have?
Oh, we have quite a few, Jacques. We have more questions than we're going to have time to answer. So, and they're great questions. So here's another one from our UFOs Odd Negotiation 8153. Have our ethics kept up with our technological advancements? Wow, I think that's an interesting question. Jeff, do you want to take that one on first?
Well, the answer is simply no. Our ethics haven't kept up with our ethics. Our ethics haven't kept up with our social development, with all kinds of issues. I mean, that's really what ethics is about, is that, much less the technology. I mean, Jacques can speak more to the technology question, but absolutely not. I mean, I think that's the whole point of the Oppenheimer movie, for example, and nuclear energy is we're not ready for this. We're not morally fit for it.
I live in Silicon Valley, and I talk to people who develop new technologies, and you ask them, what is it going to look like 10 years from now? Most of those people will not answer that question.
Yeah.
They say, I can take you through the steps for the next 5 years, what could be on the edge of discovery, what are the things we're looking for to make it better, and so on. But it could be a revolution in medicine, or it could be a lot of the AI that I've participated in was for medicine. Now the same thing could kill people, and the decision we have to make. So yes, the people developing it are very aware of the dangers, and I think we actually more people should talk to them to open that up. But they are very concerned about what will happen to those inventions, but they cannot predict how it's going to be used.
I also think, Leslie, that we are generally naive about ethics and moral values. I mean, certainly in my own field, there's a discussion on whether ethics are a function of our social relations and our social experience, our historical experience, or whether there's some ethical impulse in the universe that's external or beyond human beings that they're responding to. And I think that's a big question that we just don't know yet.
Right. Right. That's so interesting. Okay. Well, we'll go on to the next question, even though we could talk about that one for a long time, but we'll just go on. So this is a long question for Jeff from our experiencers. Metacarpals 1. This is for Jeff. You have spoken and written at length about the record of impossible experiences in all types of literature, but have you experienced the impossible, perhaps through individuals at Esalen or in your experiences in India? If so, could you share a story about some of these impossible experiences or people you have met in these places? Was there a formative experience or person that you met that ossified your belief in the impossible?
So I get asked versions of those questions a lot. So I have had an impossible experience, a major one, an out-of-body experience in 1989 in India that I've written a lot about. But I don't honestly think it's definitive or that important here. I think what is important is that people commonly have these experiences. And what really tripped me or convinced me that these experiences were important was actually working on the Esalen book in the early 2000s, because I met all who had these crazy stories that I knew were true. I knew they were telling me the truth, and I knew that we as historians and philosophers didn't have any way of taking them seriously. And so this is when I really turned to impossible experience as a historian and as someone who writes about these things, but kind of taking my own field to task, taking my colleagues to task for dismissing these or denying these. And it's not that I believe the beliefs, as I say. It's not that I want to sign my name to whatever the experiencer is reporting. There's a real collapse of experience and interpretation that we write about a lot. And so I think to interpret people's experiences as somehow codes or frameworks of other truths is itself problematic. If that makes any sense at all. That's really the impulse or the sensibility of the historian and religious, really. So it's complicated. I just want to say it's really complicated. People have these experiences. They don't fit in to worldviews. They're the origin, I think, of a lot of our religions, a lot of our culture, but they cannot be reduced to any present worldview or any contemporary worldview. So there's a kind of healing. What I want to say is there's a healing impulse here. The experiences are trying to put the person back together, but there's also suffering. And there's also a kind of opening that something's going wrong inside the story or inside the narrative, and the experience is trying to put that narrative back together, as it were. And that's really kind of the origin of my own conviction in these experiences. It's just sitting at people. It's really people that at the end of the day that convinced me that we should be taking this very seriously.
Thank you, Jeff. We can go on, I guess, to another question.
You told me to keep it short, so I'm gonna. I kept it short. I have a lot, of course, a lot more to say.
You can say more, Jeff.
No, it's okay. I said what I said, and we can pursue other strands as we go on here. It's, by the way, why I loved Jacques' work from the very beginning is because it combines this scientific external approach with this internal human approach, and you get an inside and an outside at the same time. I mean, that's really the origin of my admiration for Jacques, and why I wrote about him in really the late 2007 or 8, and which then appeared in the 2010 book.
That's a beautiful way of describing it, Jeff, I think. Describing Jacques' gift in all of this. I mean, he's a lot more than that, but
Yeah.
yeah, thanks so much. Let's go to another question, because we do have a lot of them. Whoa, this is a long one for Jacques. Okay, I'm going to read this from UFOB Toxictoy. So for Jacques, during the Soul Foundation's last monthly Soul Forum, you mentioned that there had been plans to attempt two-way communication with the, quotes, control system, unquote, with a panel of linguists and other experts. This never came to fruition. Can you please speak a bit more about this endeavor and why it was important to the experiment to determine if there is two-way communication or if it is only one direction from the control system to us? Have there been other attempts that showed some elements of two-way communication, and how is this different than direct communication with NHI?
So you have to approach those things with, a little bit of humor. And here I'm going to jump into Jeff's area in terms of the history of religion. I have a book. I've been interested in that topic for a long time, and I've bought a whole bunch of books, and I have a book about the theology of angels, which was written in the early 19th century for seminarians, about the architecture of the control system of God, which is described in a number of religious books. God doesn't communicate with angels. God essentially radiates a truth. And that truth is picked up by the archangels and all the different layers of communication inside the celestial system, and it gets to the angels. So the angels get illuminated by God. A few human beings have been illuminated by God and recorded in the religious literature. One of them fled and has never been heard of before. Afterwards, one got completely mad, and one just retreated into silence. That's what, in religious texts, that's the anecdotal side of that. An angel can communicate with another angel. So they can communicate in their level to organize certain actions about people or the world. But no angel can communicate with God. The whole thing is, I was fascinated with that because in a way it's the structure of the internet. Okay? Then the internet has clusters of and classes of devices that can communicate with each other in different ways. Some of them have only access to certain things, and some of them have access to everything. So, and I was really looking at this in terms of communication systems in general, but religion offers us a perfect example of, what is the language, what is the logic, how does it go from one level to the next, and so on. And those are absolutely amazing. So the problem here is, what is the communication and how are we going to study it? And yes, there are a number of projects that some of them are extensions of experiments to communicate with whales, which go back to the 60s or the 70s, and so on, and were prominently done in Florida and in California and so on, and about whale communication and understanding the whale's language. U.S. Navy has done a lot of work on that because they hear a lot of communication among whales and among other species, some of which they haven't identified yet. And those are extremely interesting. There is also communication, of course, with birds and with apes, which is very interesting. Now, what about the aliens? Well, the aliens control the communication, and it ranges from trivial to absurd. Most of it is through messages in the heads of witnesses who happen to be there. Some of it is alleged two-way communication, but the answers are usually not spoken. There are exceptions to that, but the answers are usually in your head. You become conscious of the answer. How do we go beyond that, and how can we initiate communication with it? Which is, of course, the key question now. How do we call them, and how do we talk to them in a way that makes sense both to them and to us? And the experiments there, non-vocal, as far as I know, but I'm not privy to the details of the communication. That's really all I know. I know Whitley Strieber has been very interested in that and has come to a similar conclusion to mine, but I haven't had a chance to discuss it with him yet.
Leslie, can I speak to that?
Please.
Jacques brought up the history of religions and angels. Human beings have been communicating with non-human intelligences for forever, as far as we can see back. And the alien experience is this mind-to-mind or telepathic experience, as we call it today, is classic, by the way. It's classic. And we have a word for it, that was coined in the 19th century, telepathic, but the phenomenon itself has been known for many centuries. And when I talk to the experiencer community, this idea that we don't know what alien abductions are about or is really puzzling to them, because they've been communicated with extensively for many, many, many decades, and they can tell you all about what the voices are saying. And to boil it down to one of the questions before about ethics, there's two real anxieties that are expressed. One is around ecological collapse, and the other is around nuclear energy. And so I think these two moral anxieties are around this abduction phenomena in a really dramatic way. And I think someone like Whitley, who Jacques just mentioned, we can talk about the experiencer content, which is really bizarre and extraordinary. And I think that's why it gets rejected, or that's why it gets dismissed. But the content itself seems to be wanting to be dismissed by the reductionists or by the rationalists, as it were. So there's something about the experience that is also deceptive. And I don't mean sinister. I don't mean bad. Let me just put it this way. If I were a future human, which I'm not, I'm a social ego like you, I would be really concerned about two things right now. I would be really concerned that human beings are going to screw up the planet ecologically, and that they're going to blow it up. And that's what you see when you look at these abduction experiences. You see this anxiety or this concern over and over and over again. So to me, that's the content, or that's part of the message. And then the other message that experiencers talk about endlessly is what John Mack called ontological shock. They really are being pushed towards a different conception of reality that is not scientific rationalism, but it's not also religious belief. It's something else. It's something that is weirder and more fundamentally strange than that. And so I think those three issues are really kind of key here. Those two moral anxieties and this sort of ontological shock that is pushing these experiences forward. And we don't know what that is because we keep wanting to explain it in terms of our own worldview. We want to quote unquote prove it, which means we just reduce it to our mathematics or our physics, or we want to believe it, which means we've reduced it to something in our religious and our ancestors' religious worldview. And what I'm trying to say is, please don't do either of those things. Please listen to the experience and let's be suspicious of it, but let's also take it very seriously.
Jacque, do you think that there are actual government agencies? I know this is sort of different from what Jeff was just talking about, which is really important, but this question does come up about whether our government agencies are actually trying to develop technology in secret, which they can use to actually try to reach these craft and communicate with them in some ways.
After Jacques speaks, I do want to speak to the communication issue and the attempt to invoke it, because that's a classic religious response as well.
I'll give you a short answer. I think the government, of course, there is no such thing as the government, but there are people in doing research within the government who go, easily from academia to, government jobs or government projects. I think those are the people we're talking to. Usually, university professors and experts in linguistics and experts in perception and biologists. And, to some extent, I people like Dr. Nolan and I are on the edge of that community and we're definitely interested. But I don't think it's necessarily something that is, classified in the sense that some of the hardware would be classified.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, just to add to that, I mean, so I exist in the academy, and I have lots of colleagues like Jacques speaking about, and my own guess is that nobody knows what this is about, including the government. We keep speak of it in the singular, and Jacques absolutely right. I don't think there is such a thing. I exist in a large institution, and I can tell you that there is no Rice University either. There are different levels, there are different hierarchies, there are different communications in it, but there's no singular source of there's no committee sitting around, making bad decisions, as it were. And I'm deeply skeptical of any of the conspiracy theories for the same reason. I just don't think people are smart enough to do that, and I don't think they're sinister enough to do that. On the other hand, the history of human thought, and certainly the history of religions, is filled with control systems. It's filled with not just suggestions, but very detailed maps of why we're being deceived. And this goes back at least 2,500 years to Plato's Republic. I mean, the parable of the cave is all about why not to trust the senses and why perception is deception. So I think this level of this trust in perception, human perception, is itself deeply mistaken and called into question by the whole history of human experience too, by the way. And that's way before there even is an American government.
Right.
That's ancient Greece. That's a philosopher talking, in the original academy, which was a grove, by the way, outside of Athens. So wow. I mean, my joke is the ultimate conspiracy theory is it's called the humanities. If you want to be suspicious of everything, just study the humanities. You will never believe anything ever again. And I say that sadly and with a smile on my face, but it's true. You learn to be suspicious of everything. And the ultimate thing we need to be suspicious of is suspicion. We need to like apply these methods to ourselves and to our own convictions in a way that I think many people are we struggle to do that.
Well, still speaking about the academia, there's also mathematics and logic and information theory, where you find the same thing. There are the theorems that for which there cannot be a proof. Okay? There are, and we know there cannot be a proof in our science, but the science from Alpha Centauri, I mean, they may be way, developed much beyond us, but that same theorem they must have thought about, and they have come they must have come to the same conclusion that you could not prove it. You couldn't prove the truth or the falsity of that assertion. Okay, so those things have been found before and thought about before, as you know, since Plato. But usually there is, if you go up a level in terms of language, if you go up a level, there may be another, and of course that's what, Eastern religion often talks about, go up a level, and then there is another universe of truth. Okay. One case I often mention, and people are probably sick of hearing it, but was a case in 1954 in France where a night watcher goes to his job in the middle of the night through a forest, comes to a clearing. There's a saucer landed in the clearing, a disc, and there is a man in front of it in coveralls, not a humanoid with a helmet and so on, just a man holding something that he points at the witness, and the witness stops. He's not paralyzed or anything. He just stops. And the man asks, what time is it? And the witness says it's 2:30 in the morning. And the man says, you lie, it's 5:00. And then he says, where am I? Am I in Germany or Italy? And of course, that's stupid because there is Switzerland in between Germany and Italy. And furthermore, he's in Alsace in France. So the night watchman says, you're in Alsace. And the man says, to freeze, goes back behind the object. We assume that he gets into the object. We don't know that. The thing takes off, and that's only at that point that he realizes this was not a helicopter, or an American pilot who had lost his way. Okay. Germany was still occupied at that point by the French, the British, and the Americans. Well, if everybody laughed, of course, at this guy, he said, well, he was still sleeping, sleepwalking to his job. But then when you look at it at the next level, there are two questions and two answers. Both of them are absurd. One is absurd about space. The other one is absurd about time. There is no space and there is no time. Now, when I talk to Dr. Eric Davis, who is my reference in modern physics, he says, of course, Jacques, where have you been? We got rid of dimensions a long time ago. I mean, in the quantum foam, there is no present, future, here, now, and so on. That's not true anymore. This is what you experience as a human being. So go on, with buying watches and so on. But that's not physically fundamental. Those are derived quantities. Well, that may be what the alien was injecting in the mind of the witness. We don't know if it's the alien. He looked human. Okay? But, we know they can take all kinds of shapes and forms. So I think that's, we have to look at the absurdity. Absurdity has a meaning in logic. It's not the end of logic. It has a meaning, and the meaning is you have to go up one level. That's what people have done in mathematics in the last century, creating new levels of mathematics in which you could solve problems that could not be solved at the elementary level. And so I think there's a parallel here between what what Jacques is saying about, about philosophy, about logic in philosophy, and then logic in mathematics and logic in science.
Yeah, I mean, Leslie, this gets into the whole question of Gnosticism too, that I know is on the table. And I mean, the notion of, for lack of a better word, expression, what we call apophatic mystical literature, or mystical literature that expresses people's experiences that deconstruct time and space, to use Jacques' language.
Mhm.
And but also deconstruct this notion of God as some kind of external being, or the soul as some kind of object. I mean, it's really radical. But people actually have these experiences, to speak to Jacques again. This is not fantasy. This is a moving up to another level, but it's another level where we see our science as human, as an expression of us, not the other way around.
I could listen to both of you talk about these topics forever. It's fascinating.
How many questions like that do you have, Leslie?
But about Gnosticism, I don't know if that's maybe, what's the question now, or if you, Jeff.
Yeah, well, let's take that one, because it relates directly to what Jacques just said. That's the moving up. That's the moving up to another level, I think. Gnosis is Greek for direct knowledge, but it's not Dionia. It's not discursive, languaged knowledge. It's not knowledge about, it's knowledge of. It's being something. And I think this moving up to another level is when you become that which you know. And so a lot of these encounters that we're speaking about, there really is a kind of Gnostic element to them, in that they're moving up to another level, and they're moving outside of space and time in a way that is dramatic. Ancient Gnosticism is often associated with the kind of anti-material, or anti-world kind of attitude. And so I'm not speaking about that here. I'm speaking about some kind of moving up that I think Jacques is speaking to as well.
Or are you implying that if one has a kind of Gnostic experience of moving up, is that something that is permanent for the person? Or are you talking about a mystical experience that then they sort of have to reintegrate in their, I mean, how does that impact the person in the long term?
I think it's relatively confusing to
Yeah.
human beings, and I think the whole notion of integration means we reduce it back to our worldview. And
You have to kind of to be on this planet and function, right?
well,
Have to do something.
I'm not sure you have to, but I think most people want to. I think there is a moral or a healing impulse there. I don't know if those two levels are really compatible, though. I mean, Jacques mentioned Asian religions. I mean, in Buddhism, for example, there's conventional truth and there's ultimate truth. And ultimate truth is not conventional truth. They're not the same at all. Um, so I'm not sure at the end of the day if they're compatible, except they're both us. They're both knowledges of human beings. And so I think they can be integrated. These traditions, like a lot of the Buddhist traditions, have integrated them. But to what extent, I'm not sure. I think we have to be critical of our religious traditions, as well as our rational or scientific traditions. We just don't know. And my joke is, my request for particularly my students is, geez, I hope you're not happy. I hope you're not integrated. I hope you're really messed up, because that's way more interesting than being happy or whole, or being integrated completely into the social system. Uh, and I think it does lead to insight, and I think it does lead to these sorts of experiences that we've been talking about.
Really interesting. Yeah.
To balance that idea, I think if you're well integrated and you're happy and your life is going on naturally, you can be replaced by AI. I mean, the question of what does it mean to be human today, is you're disturbed, you're worried about something, you're trying to create something, you're trying to break something up. I think that's very relevant.
So we talk a lot about AI, of course, in higher education. It's a real problem. It's a terrible problem, actually. And some people will say it's the worst. These are the worst times for the humanities, but they're also the best times, and that AI shines a bright light on what makes somebody human, what makes a human human, which is precisely not this mimicry or this happiness that we're talking. It's precisely the being messed up or the looking for the solution or the creative thing. And I think this is, I know we to go to Philip K. Dick here for a moment. This is Blade Runner. You know, the android is precisely the machine that looks human but can feel no emotion, can feel no distance or no emotional compassion. And so I think there is something really unique about a human being that is not AI, that is not a machine, that is not an android.
And when he strikes, when he starts feeling emotions, you have to kill him.
Yeah.
Then you're in trouble, right?
Yeah. Well, that's where we are. That's, I mean, metaphorically, that's kind of where we're at as a culture, right? That we want to eliminate the human difference, and we want everything to be AI, and we want everything to be data. You know, we don't want gnosis, we want data. You know, we want more information, not insight or realization.
It's not what I want, Jeff.
I know. I'm speaking I'm speaking out for other people. I shouldn't do that.
No. I'm just being silly. Fascinating stuff. I guess we'll just go on to another question, or you say more. Say more.
Well, I want to just talk to Jacques. I mean, the reason I personally love the UFO is precisely because no one knows what it is.
Mm-hmm.
If we had a way to frame it and explain it, I would ignore it. I would like, okay, let's go on to something else, you know? And this is again why I love Jacques' work, is it really emphasizes that not knowing, you know, and the weird and the strange and the impossible, as I call it. And that's where, again, I think the future is. And so that it speaks again to this notion of integration or happiness, but it also speaks to this question of trauma and eruption of ontological shock and kind of a future impulse that I think is at the core of what Jacques has done over the decades.
I mean, the irony of that for me, and I completely agree with you, and that's what's important about it. But the irony for me, as this reporter who's trying to convince Congress that we do know what it is. It's a physical thing. We've got radar and we've got witnesses, and it's a national security problem. I mean, the way to move the government forward is to make them think we do know and we should know more. We got to investigate to find out exactly what they are. So it sets a different. I kind of live in both worlds. I live way more in what you're talking about in terms of my own personal life, but you see what I'm saying about that?
Yes. Let me just, Jacques, let me just say a word here and then turn it over. But I love the government conversation in the halls of Congress, as it were, because it raises the issue into the stratosphere. I mean, your work with the New York Times, Leslie, has been definitive there. I love all that, but I also love this push that it's weirder than you think. It's
Yeah.
it's not only a machine. It is a machine. It does leave burn marks on trees. It does all this physical stuff, and it does all this telepathic mind-to-mind stuff. And how do we think? It just blows up all of our categories, you know, because we want to separate those two, and we want to say some things are mental and some things are material. And I think by mental we mean they're not real. And I think by material, we mean they're real. But here's an example of, okay, they're both real, they're both happening. So what do we do with that? You know?
It's true. And I think, the work that I do involves only one side of that, which is the physicality and the national security. And the officials don't necessarily want to know about the weirdness part of it, even though
It's creeping in on it's still there.
and I think some of them know more than we might think as well. But it's just an interesting dichotomy in a way.
Yeah.
Anyway, anything else? Well, I guess should we go on to another question now? Okay. This is for Jeff. From our experiencers is from Wooden Passenger 8683. In some of his podcasts, Whitley Strieber said that when you personally visited him, this is to Jeff, of course, when you, Jeff, personally visited him, that his grays started interactions with you personally and taught you concerning certain aspects of the concept of time. How was this organized by the beings? That's a loaded question.
Okay. Whitley and I room together. We room together at Esalen. And my joke is don't room with Whitley Strieber. That's always a mistake. Don't do that. Weird things happen around Whitley. He's radioactive, as I joke. There's something different about him. And I think there have always been human beings like that are just different. And the experience he's talking about there, I think, is one of these events. It was during the middle of the night. Willie gets up in the middle of the night to meditate. I don't know, you probably know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was actually about midnight, I think. So this was well before that. I was asleep, but there was a part of me that wasn't asleep. So I split into two clearly. I had this distinct memory, and this other part of me was witnessing something going on in the room that astonished me. And I remember hearing my voice in my head say, "Oh my God." And it was very distinct, Leslie. It wasn't subtle, but I knew that wasn't me with my eyes looking at the room. That was some other part of me. I knew that instantly. And then when I woke up and I looked at the room, I didn't see anything, of course. There was nothing. I heard a crash, by the way. I assumed that a lamp had been knocked over or that something had fallen. Nothing had fallen, physically anyway. So this was a splitting of the self that took place in Whitley's presence, and there was definitely something going on in the room that a part of me was witnessing, but it wasn't a part of me that I was aware of or conscious of or could control. I think that's what Whitley's talking about there.
And it didn't have to do with the grays per se then, right?
Well, that's how he would talk about them as the visitors, of course. He wouldn't use that language of the grays. But he's had a lifelong interaction with them, as Jacques mentioned earlier, and I think that's a very genuine and very honest description of what happened.
What year, by the way, was your experience?
What was my experience, Jacques?
What year was it?
Which year?
What year? That was probably 2019 or 2018. I mean, you were likely there. You were likely in another room there. It's one of the seminars we were at. It was in C, where it was SEA, the room in the annex there on off of Murphy House.
Well, as you know, I had an experience that scared me profoundly just a few years ago, and it's related in the book in volume 6. I was sleeping, and all of a sudden, I was in another part of the apartment, facing a being, definitely, but it was a block of of shadow, really, and I was very close to it, and it wasn't hostile or anything. It was just there, in a place that in an earlier experiment we had identified as a place for psychic functioning of some sort or manifesting something, and it was there. And I had forgotten, not exactly forgotten, but I had pushed the earlier experiments out of my life. I was busy with other things, and I was terrified. And I was projected back into my bed, still sleeping. So this was really the first time I had, a true out-of-body experience that I could not control. And it's good that I couldn't control it, because I probably would have gotten lost trying to control it. people talk about how hard it may be to get back into your body. I definitely was. My body was asleep the whole time, and I woke up crying and just terrified. Now, I in retrospect, there was nothing terrifying about the the entity. And you told me, Jeff, when I relayed that to you, that it might be another part of me, and
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that. That's not what we were trying to get to. We were trying to get, again, at a form of communication with a higher level of beings. Now, again, there is no UFO in that story. What makes it different is that I was outside my body and conscious that I was outside my body. And that's what terrified me, not the being itself, engaging in any kind of communication with it.
Yeah, I mean, I get this criticism a lot, and I know it's not a criticism from you, it's just a question. I wanna say it's us, it's some other part of the human being, but people come back, rightfully so, and understandably so, but it's a being, it's an entity, it's external to the human being. I guess my thought there, or my response is, yes, but the human being is the one talking about it. It's still an experience of us. It might be something external to us, it might be an entity, but it's still us talking about that entity or talking about that experience. So, and referred earlier to this single out of body experience I had in Calcutta in 1989, Jacques, and it was extensive and extreme, and it involved a kind of subtle energy or a kind of profound presence that either came out of my body or came out of the room, did things to me very physically, and it imploded then into my heart region, and I had this experience of leaving my body, and I was similarly afraid because of that leaving the body, not because of anything I think that was inherent to the experience or to the content of the event. So I completely understand and accept what you're saying. I just wonder at the end of the day whether it's still us or whether it's, and by us I don't mean Jeff, I don't mean Jacques, I don't mean Leslie, I don't mean these social egos. I mean some other kind of vastness, some other kind of cosmic presence that is using our bodies as a kind of node or biological place to manifest, as it were. I don't know. I just don't know about that, and there are different answers to that, and certainly in human culture that I think are worth thinking about, and worth talking about. Way more sophisticated than I think most people realize.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, both of you. A question for Jacques from our UFOs, UFO Sloth. Jacques, a question regarding the following excerpt from your latest book, Forbidden Science 6, quotes, "Opulence was de rigueur as Gary Nolan and I politely awaited our turn to present our speculative deal before venture tycoon Peter Thiel, an investment genius and Donald Trump supporter," close quotes. What exactly did you and Gary Nolan pitch to Peter Thiel, and is that project still alive in some form today?
So Peter Thiel has gone on to help fund a project led by a very bright woman to build advanced databases, which obviously where he can be of great counsel, and in terms of capturing UFO experiences and looking for patterns within it. And I think people in the field have been aware of that effort to gather those databases, and it's ongoing. And the question was, we were looking for something different because of the the work we've been doing with recovered objects or recovered materials after landings, after interaction with UFOs. And we wanted to show Mr. Thiel what we had to see what ideas he would have. I have a lot of respect for him as a very successful colleague in venture capital. He was successful in funding companies that some of us had tried to do and couldn't do. One of them was PayPal. PayPal is not an easy system to build, and there had been many failures before. He was one of the key investors in PayPal. So there is we may disagree on certain things, obviously, but there is certainly some element of mutual respect, certainly a lot of respect from my side for his achievements, which are intellectual achievements. You don't do that just by writing a big check. Especially not when you're the first investor in something. So that's the way Silicon Valley works, and that's the way the unique, I think, genius of the American venture capital industry has been, both in medicine and so both Gary and I were there to with a just completely open question. What are we going to do with all this? Where do we start? And obviously, I had started with the data processing side of it, the AI on top of complex databases that I had done with Mr. Bigelow. I mean, we had done at the Bath project, sponsored by the government. But that project was terminated for no clear reason. So we never went to build the AI layer that was really critical to everything else. So it's essentially what's known in Silicon Valley as a dead puppy. Okay, and somebody will pick it up at some point. But we were not talking about that. We were talking about something more radical, especially on the material sense. And we're still wondering where that should go. And to answer that, we have to do a lot more work in the lab first before we can theorize. So that's essentially that's the whole answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you. This is another fairly long one from our UFOs. The name of the person is Pitiful Mulberry 1738. I don't know how they come up with these creative names, but they're really great. Okay, as someone who has had a clear, close-range encounter with what appeared to be a structured, intelligently controlled craft without any psychological or paranormal elements, how do you reconcile cases like mine with the broader narrative that leans toward non-material or consciousness-based interpretations of the phenomenon? Additionally, why do you think there's been resistance or hesitation, even within ufology, to seriously explore the extraterrestrial hypothesis as focus of the discussion begins to drift towards consciousness? I think that's addressed to either one of you or both of you.
Well, I'll take it up. I mean, I know Jacques written about this explicitly. I mean, the reason that there's skepticism around the extraterrestrial hypothesis is it just doesn't work in a lot of cases. It doesn't make a lot of sense. In terms of the first question about how to explain physical craft and a kind of material encounter as opposed to a paranormal or consciousness one, I personally think our big block here is that we want to split those two things. We want to split mind and matter in a way that probably isn't faithful or probably isn't reflective of reality. And so I think we should be calling into question those assumptions that there's some difference between materiality and for lack of a better word, spirituality. I think that they're probably the same thing. So there's a deeper question there for me about how we're doing that. But I certainly wouldn't wouldn't call into question or deny those experiences. They're obvious. There's many of them, countless.
Yeah. So there are two questions there that are very different, but mm, my my rebuttal would be it is a rebuttal. I mean, why do they why bring in the extraterrestrial idea? Because if any of this is real, it opens up the whole ball of wax. Extraterrestrial is, I admit the first book I wrote back in France was about an extraterrestrial exploration and what does it mean and how do we do it so that we understand the layers that we're going to encounter and all that. And what can science, how does science need to evolve? What do we need to build to be able to access what we're going to find, which is a logical thing to do. But the more, as Jeff said, the more I accumulated cases and people sent me cases and I went there to study them and to investigate them, the less sense it made to say these are aliens from, Alpha Centauri. I mean, why would there be so many of them? And why do they? And the literature is absurd. It says they are hiding to study us. Well, they're not hiding. I mean, just in that, in Bob Bigelow's project, funded by the Defense Intelligence Agency, we ended up with 260,000 cases. Now, when reporters call NASA says, well, we're aware of 2 or 3, incidents. Well, we have this big gap in the culture right here within a few miles and between 2 buildings in Washington. Okay. So it's not for me to bridge that gap. I mean, I don't know how to do it, but I can tell you all the other, not all of them. I can come up with a lot of other hypotheses that make a lot more sense. Okay. And people have done that. And it's really an empty game because that's not the way to do it. If you do that in science, you end up in a trap. You end up trapped in something. And I think physics right now is trapped in a number of those dead ends where no matter how many more billions you put and how much bigger you make the instrument, you're just digging into mysteries and mysteries of mysteries and so on. And it's okay to do that until you run out of money, but there are other ways of doing it. They are looking at nature in more intelligent ways and trying to interrogate it so that it begins to give us some answers in response. And nature does that. Nature is very good answering our questions. Sometimes it's dangerous, but that's the way in practice. That's the way science has worked. So yes, they could be extraterrestrials hiding as something else, and all those things are possible, and you can construct things around that. But again, it's premature to do that. The the extraterrestrial idea does not answer the data we've got on our desk. It just doesn't, for the reasons that Jeff just mentioned. So I think you should take your experience and use it as your point of departure to ask questions about the world, about the universe, about what's around you. Not immediately look for the quick answer, the easy answer. They're just a bunch of ETs. Okay. Now, I had that argument with Steven Spielberg when he was, finishing the script for Close Encounters, And someone brought us together over lunch, and I said, if they are not ETs, it's even more interesting. He said, "You're right, but my public is expecting ETs, and I'm going to give them some ETs." And he was, $800 million later, turns out he was right, okay? Nobody would have understood. And there was another movie in which they consulted me in passing, and I said, you could do something interesting by having the flying saucer in a cave, and then they try to do something with the flying saucer, and the aliens don't like it, and they go out of the cave through another dimension, and which is what many witnesses describe. I mean, not with a cave, but they describe a change of dimensions in the object, which most of the time they don't report because they know that would be too much for the people taking the report. And people forget to ask, how did it leave? How did it go away? Well, if you ask that question, you find some interesting answers. So in the movie, they didn't do that. I mean, they paid me for my advice, and then they have the thing inside the cavern, and then when the thing goes off, it blows up the mountain. Now, of course, cinematically, I should have known that. And when you have a chance to blow up a mountain, that's what you do. You don't go where there's another dimension and it's because of Einstein and so on, and then you can disappear from here and you can appear there like the Tic Tacs. Okay, no, 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 no. You don't do that. You just blow it up. Okay, this is America. So I recognize that. I have no answer to that. But again, don't fall into the pitfall of assuming the answer when you're just at the beginning of doing the problem.
Leslie, if I can add to that, I mean, it's not just a matter of beginning. I think also when you develop such a experience or worldview, it doesn't ever make sense. I mean, this is one of my conclusions of talking to experiencers. Actually, the more you talk to them, the weirder the story gets. It doesn't somehow resolve itself at the end. There's no mountain blowing up, to use Jacques' slang. It just gets weirder and weirder and stranger, and you're like, "Okay." And this sense of, the other thing Jacques spoke to, I think beautifully, they had 260,000 cases in the Bigelow study, but actually there are millions of there are probably billions of cases. So it's a matter of, people ask me all the time, "Well, is disclosure increasing?" I'm like, "Well, how would we know that?" Maybe the social censor is lifting a bit and people are more willing to talk about these experiences, but I suspect they've always happened in throughout the population, throughout the species, but there've been heavy social censors to keep these stories down, or reasonable or rational, or they get expressed in religious ways, in our folklore and our mythology. So I think that's one of the questions I have really is how are these experiences expressed by different cultures and different times, and can they be expressed today? And the answer is no, they can't be. They need to blow up the mountain. They can't go into some other dimension. Even though that's our physics, that's Einstein, you know.
Leslie, there's a study going on in which I'm participating partially, and that's very interesting, going on in England, and it's called UNHIdden, where the NHI is the National Health Institution of Great Britain. And they just published this report because they said, all your physics, that's fine, that's really interesting. But what about the experiences? What about the people that Jeff was just talking about, the witnesses? They are hurt. They are hurt psychically and sometimes physically, many times physically, and nobody cares. I mean, their doctor, if they admit to their doctor that this came from a UFO, it only makes the case worse. Okay, it's called the impact of exceptional experiences
Yeah. Did
and
you pull it up again? So because
disclosure,
yeah.
on mental health. Okay.
And I know that the group has a website, so I'm assuming that that paper is available on their website.
Yes.
Thank you,
So
Jacques.
that study is being funded in England, and they use a graph that comes from a presentation I made at Stanford a couple of years ago about the distribution of cases. Now, on close to zero, you see that little hill, which is the cases that Congress talks about. Cases that come from airplanes, from the armed forces, from the people in government, and so on. And then the curve to the right is the cases that I study. And those are from farmers, people in the field, people who've seen something, who've been hurt as well, but they, I don't know what happened to this. They've been hurt, and they've felt it, in their bodies, and nobody is interested in those cases, and there are many more. As Jeff just said, those cases are all over the place, and we don't hear about them because everybody wants to know, what happened to the astronauts, what happened to the people in the armed forces, what happened to the aviators, which is important because of the instruments they had at their disposal that can give us technical information. But I assure you that the farmer in the field has technical information that we've never really listened to, and we should. And again, close that parenthesis, but I wanted to mention that study in England because we have to do something about the witnesses who have been profoundly affected and often hurt psychologically, socially, and physically by the phenomenon. And right now we're ignoring them.
Right. I just so much agree with you, Jacques, and I'm working on trying to find ways to integrate them, that realm, into the mainstream dialogue as much as we can, because I just really feel for what you're saying. I just want to mention to the questioner too, he or she might want to consult the paper by Hal Puthoff, The Ultraterrestrial Hypothesis, in which I'm sure you both have read it, because Hal goes into all the various different hypotheses, including the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that could explain the phenomenon. And it's just a really interesting paper for anybody who is looking for that kind of information. I would just recommend that.
Yeah, how I agree. It's a great summary of the hypotheses. He forgot to add one, which is something else, question mark. Because in all those lists, you should always have one more that says, okay, these are the 12 things I could think about based on today's science.
Yeah.
There will be the science tomorrow. When you look at the history, when I wrote the book about Trinity, I went through the history of Trinity. Many of the physicists, American physicists who were consulted, said that gadget isn't going to work. You're wasting your time and your money, trying to build a nuclear bomb, because it couldn't. And those were physicists, said it couldn't possibly have this kind of a reaction. No, fortunately, there were people who didn't agree with that. And that's a situation where we may get to with UFOs. It can only be A, B, and C. What about X? And X may be something that some witness somewhere has observed by chance or because he was more aware of that. And that may be where we should go.
It seems like it's always really X, and that's the world that Jeff lives in. It's always X, and it's always going to be X, no matter what the hypotheses are. And I just wanted to mention too, Jeff, regarding the experiencers and the need for them to be, more recognized and for their data to be valued. The study that is going on at the Archives of the Impossible that Karen Austin and others are working on is dealing really with trying to bring forward some of that data, as I understand it. I just wonder if you might want to explain a little bit about what's going on there, because I think it's going to help a lot with the very problem that Jacques just outlined with, with taking them more seriously.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the study's led by Karen, as you mentioned. Karen Austin is the project manager for Archives of the Impossible project at Rice, and she's leading this metadata study, which is really one of the first and major scientific studies. It actually is going to use AI to sort of comb through these experiencer accounts, and it very much is designed to speak to this question of what is the content of the experiencer accounts, and what are they hearing, but in doing it in a scientific kind of way that involves scanning and listening to the experiencer accounts, and not just the scientific reports or the cases. So it's an attempt to do science, but also on the experiencer accounts themselves.
Right. And there's also a lot more support groups, I think, for experiencers, and many more conversations that have, in recent years, that have been set up and are ongoing. And a lot of them are taking place through Karen Austin and the group of people she works with. So it just seems like there's more resources and there's sort of more, the experiencer conversation is just becoming more a part of the bigger picture now. I don't know if you would agree, but I know there are more support groups and more ways that experiencers can connect with each other. And I think Reddit is one of those places, and that the Reddit people have support groups. So I've just been sensing that there's sort of a groundswell going on there.
Absolutely. Also in the psychiatric community, frankly, that Doug spoke to with UNHIdden in the UK, but also in the American psychiatric community. I do want to add that this resistance to anomalous or impossible experiences is not unique to the UFO by any stretch.
Right.
I hear from professional writers, for example, all the time, who have things like precognitive experiences and experiences with the dead, or some kind of materialization or teleportation, and they tell me they can't speak to their psychiatrist or their therapist about it because they won't be listened to. They'll be considered crazy. So that kind of pathologization of an experience that is really common and very human, I think is a real issue. And that's the kind of problem that I do think we can go after in the academy, because I think this sort of materialism is at the root of this. And I think that the academy is partly to blame for that particular philosophical interpretation of what the science has done. The science is not a philosophical interpretation; it's a method of knowing.
Mhm.
Materialism is an interpretation of the impacts of science, and as Jacques has mentioned, science itself is very weird. I mean, mathematics, for example, if you talk to mathematicians, most of them are Platonists, by the way. They think that numbers exist in some kind of esoteric space, and that we discover these mathematical equations. We don't construct them or create them in our heads. Well, that's a Platonic ancient doctrine. That is not, and they don't always even know that. But that's something that I think we still don't have any real understanding of, is why does the math work? Why do equations that we make up in our heads turn out to correspond to material reality, and we can get a man or a person to the moon and back, as it were, and do that successfully with just math, basically? That's weird. That's
Yeah.
that's really, really weird. And we don't know why that is the case.
Mm.
There are mathematicians who've come out of computer studies and information science, who claim and rationally that mathematics is an experimental science, that it's not a theoretical construct, that it comes out of experience. And those are very, very interesting papers. But of course, there are marginalized.
Can you say more about that, Jacques? I'm not sure.
I can send you something about that. I won't get into the weeds, but it's very clean, and it's very profound.
Mm,
But
thank
when
you.
you start thinking of all those theorems as experimental, which may be true or not, if we were to test them, in full scale, then that opens up all kinds of things. And of course, that's where information science is going and where computer science is going in the theoretical area.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, I guess we'll have another question. We have, I don't know how much more time, but we'll keep going a little bit longer if that's okay with both of you.
Fine.
And I love the questions and the answers. So this is a question for Jacques from our experiencers from MantisAwakening. Question for Jacques. How much do you think the US government truly understands about the phenomenon on both the technical side and maybe more importantly, the ontological side?
So, yeah, it's a very good question. Given the fact that there is no such thing as the U.S. government, I mean, that there are groups of people who are charged with making laws and applying laws to different activities within the country. They respond to a culture that I think I can say that coming from Europe, in my early years, a culture that's very constrained by the geography of the United States and the fact that the United States historically was constructed in meaning to be different from the royalty and from the kingdoms and all the other fighting things out in Europe and elsewhere as a republic. And so it's natural when you're in that kind of country. First, the value is really in creating things that are useful. The value is industry and the economy, which is driven by industry, and the value is in protecting the country from threats outside, because the United States doesn't realize how different it is from all the other political systems out there. Of course, it was designed to be different from all the failed political systems out there. So the first question you have to answer is it a threat? Is it going to be a threat to the country? Is it going to force me to change the way, think of how long it took the United States to enter World War II. I mean, World War II was something that was going on in Europe, and it was just one more war, and it took time for the United States to realize that it was getting so big that it was going to affect everything around the world, and that you couldn't escape the war. And but that in the process you're going to change the world. And I think that with UFOs it's the same kind of thing. It's first perceived as a threat. Think of all the movies from the 50s or the 60s. Somebody sees something and an object comes in and creates some catastrophe, and then we send the cops, and the cops can't do anything, and then you send the army, and then you send the tanks, and then you send the big, and Godzilla is a perfect example of that from Japan. It's a threat, okay? And it forces us to the limits of our thinking. Well, the rest of the world doesn't think that way. I mean, the French government, when it set up a number of groups to study the reports, because out of the feeling that if people were interested, the government had to respond in some rational way if we could. And so they set up these committees that don't do very much, but they at least provide a response to citizens who've seen something. And they look beyond the threat. I mean, from what we know about the phenomenon, if it wanted to take over the planet, I mean, it would take 10 minutes. I mean, you don't even need, bombs with the kinds of things we've seen them doing, okay, on a large scale. And so that's a really a moot point. But of course, in terms of industry, to justify investing in the study, you have to say, look at the things we're going to discover. We'll have anti-gravity, we'll have special beams that can heal people, we'll be able to grab things at a distance and pull them. We're going to be able to do all these wonderful things. So that's why we're in looking at UFOs, because of all the technology we're going to get. Unless it's a game. And as part of the game, we might still get some technology. So it could be a game to the advantage of the people who are capable of playing the game. But there are these other levels that we avoid talking about in most conversations. So I think that's what we have to think about, that the subject is not one of, that is splitting mind with matter or any of those things. It's a new thing. And at least it's an old thing that we're looking at with new eyes. And I think that's the basis of what we need to build, including technology.
So can I speak? Can I speak to that? I mean, so it's just to reiterate what Jacques just said. I mean, that Cold War invasion narrative is exactly what I'm talking about. I think that's the mythology we have to get beyond. And what we talk about all the time in the Archives of the Impossible, including the metadata study with the experiencers, is this threat narrative. And why is everything so negative? Why is it so bad? I mean, really? That's actually not what the experiencers experience. Yes, there is this negative aspect to it, absolutely, but there's also this positive ecstatic aspect to it that is very much a part of the content of the encounters. And that, by the way, is a classical religious experience too, that the sacred is not the good. The sacred is it can kill you as easily as it can redeem you. And so this has been the human experience for millennia again. And I think where we're at with the technological aspect and the scientific aspect is a new stage in this old process that Jacques talking about. We need to do it differently. We need a new worldview. We need new knowledge now. But it's actually, these are old problems. And if this was really about invasion, again, as Jacques said, we would have been toast a long time ago. Come on. We're still here. We're not only here, there's too many of us. We're overpopulating the planet. So clearly this is not an invasion. This is something else.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll have time for just a couple more questions. Let's go to the next one. This is for Jacques from our experiencers, PurpleJadzia. Jacques, I was wondering if there is a particular rare book or manuscript in your collection that has offered insight you haven't found anywhere else, or perhaps a favorite passage from one that you'd be willing to share.
Well, I have been collecting books for a long time, and not necessarily because they were rare, but many of them are rare. The one that I often discuss with Dr. Hynek, because we had the same interest on this, on the more, the more spiritual aspect of it, is a book by an old book by now by Manly Hall, who lived in Los Angeles, was a philosopher and a great lecturer. And the book is called Secret Teachings of All Ages. So it's dated from the times of, some of the great secret societies, and they had wonderful trappings and ceremonies and so on. But it ranges over all the major cultures of the world, and it's wonderfully illustrated. If you can find an old copy of it, they are getting expensive. But Manly Hall was a great lecturer. He was a friend of Dr. Hynek. Dr. Hynek consulted him many times about UFOs, introduced me to him, and I remember spending time in that library with the two of them, and that was sort of a great moment in my education. I'm not going to say my mystical education because I'm not at that level, but it does touch on that. There is a book in French about the Rosicrucians called Histoire and Doctrines, History and Doctrines of the Rosicrucians. That's at a much lower level. It just talks about the movement of the 18th century, which is related to the Invisible College and to the growth of science in Great Britain outside and often against the religious dictates. And it's an interesting book. Again, it's not, but it's in French. What I'm doing now is I keep going back to two people who represent, I think, what we should be doing in science. And to some extent, they had failures, both of them, like scientists do. One is Paracelsus, and the other one is John Dee. Paracelsus as a founder of many of the ideas in modern medicine that have become ideas in modern medicine, as opposed to the medieval way of treating people. He was still the transition between the elemental chemical theory of illness and treating illnesses and the looking at the organism as a whole in a completely different way. And his life is amazing, and his thinking is amazing, including in chemistry and in the nature of reality and the spirit in reality. And John Dee was in many ways he was a failed politician for one thing, but he was not considered as a great scientist. I mean, but he was. I mean, he was a great applied scientist, and he explored the frontiers also, very much in the way in which Paracelsus would do it. Both of them were looking at elemental physics and at processes in the lab, not just at theories, and linking it for the good of humanity. John Dee's major claim to fame was his inventions in the field of coordinate travel around the world and the compass and navigation. That, of course, for which he was paid the big bucks by the Crown of England to deploy the English fleet. So a lot of his work was applied mathematics, but a lot of his private work was about the philosophy of contact with higher beings and learning from those other beings. And he ran into some areas where he made mistakes. And those are interesting, finding great people and then looking at their mistakes is certainly what you do in Silicon Valley, so that you can build a computer that works a little bit better than the next guy. And that's certainly the truth right now in artificial intelligence. And both of them were very current in their mystical and magical thinking in terms of what happens now with the technologies that were being developing.
Wow. Thank you. Jeff, do you have any book or books other than your own, of course, because both of your books are very relevant, but that sort of speak to that you'd want to share, that really speak to you deeply about the kind of things we're dealing with at this point in the evolution of all of this? I mean, is there any book you'd want to share, recommend to people?
It's not a book, but The Archives of the Impossible is this.
Yeah.
This Jacques really originated that, as you mentioned early on, through his own papers and files. And I know from many years now working with the archivists at Rice that they're most interested in one of a kind, rare documents, letters, papers, files, cases. And the reason I have spent so much time, so much of my life with these archives is precisely because of this. They're meant to be public, they're meant to be accessible in the future, and it's a legacy, I mean, the truth is none of us are gonna be around in 100 years or 50 years, We're mortal beings, but this kind of query or this kind of inquiry will continue, and an archive is one way that this conversation can continue. I would also say, Jacques won't say this, he's too humble, but I think the gold mine here is the journals. I really believe that. The forbidden science, the 6 of them, they're unequaled in this field, and the last one, Scattered Castles, it's the finest explanation for why there are archives at all, and the short answer is research. The short answer is you don't want to chop this thing up into classified research agendas. You want to make it public, and you want to talk about this in a conversational, intergenerational way. And so I would really pitch archives as the way to move forward here. And I would also propose that people read Jacques' journals, which are very long, by the way, but are also the gold standard, I think. If you really want to know what this whole thing is about, go read those journals.
But there was one question that we may not have time to get to, but somebody took me to task and said, you're doing all this work essentially, but you're going to die like everybody else, and without the answer. And I hear that question. It's a fair question to ask as a scientist, but a scientist never gets the answer.
No.
There are. This is a mystery, but there are all kinds of other mysteries that we study, that people at Stanford are paid to study, where they know very well they're not going to get the ultimate answer. You can ask a cancer researcher, you're doing this, but people will continue to die of cancer for a long time. Well, yeah, but with cures, we can cure some categories of cancers with surgery or with chemistry and so on. And the others, we continue to study, and my students will continue to study them, and eventually we'll be able to save more people, and it's going to, it's going to change. I worked for a number of years at Stanford for an astrophysicist named Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel was studying, among other things, the solar corona. Nobody has been able to figure out the solar corona yet. I mean, there are theories about it, but the surface of the sun is fairly cold with respect to the interior of the sun, which is millions of degrees. So in many equations in astrophysics, you take the surface of the sun as temperature 0 because it's good enough. It's not 0, it's thousands of degrees. But in terms of astrophysics, it might as well be 0. So to make the equations easier to work with, you take the surface of the sun at 0. Now you go out from the sun, and you move in space. And as you know, if you've seen a picture of a total eclipse, there's this thing called the corona. The corona is at millions of degrees. How did it get there? I mean, there is millions of tons of matter in the corona at millions of degrees. What happened? how did that energy get vested in that particular part of space outside the sun at a particular distance and so on? What does it mean? Well, Peter Thiel used to laugh at this and say, he's been instrumental in much of the physics we know now about the corona. I mean, a lot of progress has been made and so on. But it's still, something of an enormous mystery out in space, and it's our sun. That we're not talking about Alpha Centauri and other galaxies as well. We're talking about something we see every day, and we can't figure that out. Okay, science is full of mysteries like that, and we still haven't gotten the last word on the physics of the corona. In the meantime, it doesn't cost, and he was laughing because we were in his office writing equations on paper, and I was going to take them to the computer and compute models and so on. We actually published an article together, the physics of the solar corona. But it doesn't cost anything. I mean, a little bit of computer time that you could do today with your PC, okay? And he said, in the meantime, in Switzerland, they have this whole thing with 500 PhDs and this whole thing that costs billions of dollars to try to find the next particle. And then after they have a God particle, they find that there are other particles that are more interesting than the God particle and so on. And it costs, essentially the budget of the average country to run this whole thing. In the meantime, we had equations on paper that I could turn into computer programs, and we could manage the answers. So yes, we will die without knowing the last thing about the corona, and the last thing about cancer, and the last thing about all kinds of new things we're going to discover in the process of doing this. But that's all right. I mean, the satisfaction, certainly in medicine, is that there are people now we can cure of cancer. Right? And now, when 20 years ago, those people would have died. And so that's not, that's a question about life. Why are you doing this? Well, I think we're all doing this because we want to understand the world we're in. And at the end of the day, there was another question, in this, given all this, what should you do with your life? And my answer to that, we didn't get to that question, but it's an interesting one. The main one is take care of your family and the people around you and your neighbors. I mean, that's where you are, even if you're an astronomer or an astronaut or a great, medical researcher. Don't forget that. And then, think about the city and the country and, what is going to mean. Look at AI. I mean, we should talk more about, not just be impressed with the fact that this machine has given some brilliant answer to a question. It's designed to give brilliant answers, but are the answers worth anything? And there's other questions we should have asked that we didn't ask. And so I think those are the things we should be doing, and not just consume television, and especially with UFOs. I mean, people are consuming television. In this paper that we just published, and in the previous paper that I published with Dr. Nolan, again, we know about all the witnesses. All the witnesses have been interviewed. We know where it was. We can go back to the exact place. We know what the thing looked like from different angles. We have energy estimates. We have all of that. Okay. What you see on television or what you see before Congress is stories with no beginning, no end. You don't know who the guy was who took that picture. That picture is just a blur in the sky. You don't even know, what the temperature was. And this is worthless. Now, admittedly, cancer, is has been solved with, going through case after case after case of people who died, trying to understand how they died. And you have to go through a lot of mess before you can build a theory, and then the theory will give you some insights into the nature of the phenomenon. But that's what we need to do.
Thank you. I think we'll have another question now. We're going to have, I think, 2 or 3 more, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, this is one addressed to me, and of course, I hope everyone, we can all respond to it. But it says, "Your book Surviving Death makes a compelling case for the existence of our consciousness beyond death." Thank you for that. Some ufologists have pointed out the similarities between UAP abductions and near-death experiences. They take place in a similar state of consciousness. Do you believe that some NHI are residing in the spirit or astral realm? Okay, well, that's a really interesting question. In terms of the last part, oh, thank you for showing the book cover. I can't really say where NHI dwell and what the different realms are and what they mean. But in thinking about abductions and NDEs, I actually think there's a lot of differences. I mean, the similarities are obvious that, often they're in some kind of altered state of consciousness. They're going into some other kind of dimension or reality that is not part of our normal physical waking world. But I mean, I also think there's a lot of differences between those 2 experiences, and I'm going to frame the abduction experience as being one that is actually a physical, real experience, because so many of the abductees really want it to be recognized as a physical experience, that they were actually taken against their will into a ship and then brought back. And so looking at it that way, the NDE is very different. I mean, when a person has a near-death experience, they're actually physically dead and they're unconscious and they're traumatized because they've died, basically. And then their consciousness goes into this other realm and has this usually very positive experience. So they come back with this extremely positive recollection of what happened to them, and they're not afraid of death. And it's immediately kind of something that's life-changing in a very positive way. Whereas an abduction experience does not have that effect on people. It's usually, especially if we're looking at the ones that they describe as being very physical, they're terrifying, they're traumatized. If you look at, the story of Whitley Strieber and many other people, what they went through in terms of coping with the physical effects and the psychological effects of these experiences that happened against their will. And so, I think also abductions often occur with people throughout their lives. It's something that happens when you're a child, whereas a near-death experience usually will just happen once. And again, it's associated with being dead. So I think they're quite different. And even I think one thing that's interesting though is that both of them open up the mind and expand the mind dramatically. And people often will develop greater perceptual abilities after these 2 experiences, whether it be, greater abilities to perceive and to have things like clairvoyance or precognition and all the things that are kind of opened up. And an example being the case of Elizabeth Crone, who had a near-death experience and then had all these things happen to her. So that often happens too after an abduction, but I think in essence they're quite different. So I don't know. That's just my perception. And if you, Jacques and Jeff would like to add to that and give us your sense of how they interconnect, that would be great.
I think this is precisely the conversation we should be having, right? I mean, this is it. I mean, clearly they're related and clearly they're different, and it's that physicality that Willie speaks of very eloquently, but also Karen Austin. Karen Austin speaks to that same physicality very, very clearly. But the near-death experiences, they have their own physicality too. I mean, Elizabeth Crone you mentioned, I mean, she was literally struck by lightning. I mean, they talk about physicality. So there is again, I just wanna say that's the conversation we should be having. I don't think we know how they're connected, but they seem to be connected, but they're also very different. I know that doesn't that's not satisfying, but I think that's obviously the case.
I think that's the case too. It's just hard to, and I'm fascinated with trying to find those connections. I think all of us are. It's very difficult to do that.
You have to, as a culture, though, you have to acknowledge that those events happened to have that conversation. This is the deeper point. You can't have that conversation until you acknowledge those experiences as part of the human reality.
It seems that near-death experiences have more recognition than abductions, really. They're
Only recently, right? I mean,
recently, and they're more similar to each other, and they've been written about by medical doctors, and lots of studies have been done on them, and so on.
yeah, this
It's
is this is
more mainstream.
this is where my eyes roll a bit, because it's always the doctors, right? It's people in white coats that authorize a conversation, and I don't mean to dismiss medical doctors at all. I'm just saying, why do we need the medical doctor to affirm something that people have been talking about for a long, long time? Why do we do that? That's the deeper question that I really want to answer.
I think the answer is because in order to create a paradigm shift that ripples up into the
I know.
world, we have to do it that way, or it's not going to penetrate.
I know. I know that answer, and that answer is correct, but it's just disappointing to me.
I understand that, but that's sort of what my job has been to try and do.
Yeah. Well, guess what? Jacques, the farmers are seeing the UFOs and having the encounters too. It's not just military people.
It's going to take them seriously, but they're going to take the doctor seriously. That's the bottom line, and that's just how it is. We need both. We need both.
Many people spontaneously, many witnesses relate the two things. Or they think that if they've seen something, it's an omen. People around the world, in other cultures would do that also, thinking if you see a UFO, it may be an omen of death. It could be a prediction of death. I enjoyed your book, Leslie, and you brought in some of the leading thinkers into this, and both from the physiology and from the physics and the metaphysics. There is a French scientist named Flammarion, F-L-A, like a flame, Flammarion, who was an astronomer, who was a very prolific writer about science, and especially about astronomy, in the early 20th century and first half of the 20th century. And I collected some of his books because they were so, so well done describing phenomena in the sky. But he also wrote about death. And he wrote 3 books. One is Manifestations of the Living, Manifestations at Death, and Manifestations Beyond Death. And I thought that was, and I'm starting to reread those 3 books because it's an interesting, it should be just one thing. I mean, essentially, a ghost shows up and tells you something or says, I'm your great grandmother and, you should buy this kind of car. Or they say, or they just make an impact at an emotional level. You see a shadow passing from one room to another. And in fact, it is an omen of something happening, somebody that's very close to you who is dying far away, and you're going to find out later. Or it could be that you have a message just like that from somebody who is still alive. And I spoke to a ghost researcher here in San Francisco who is very dedicated and doing it very scientifically. And he told me you get the same kinds of reports from people. He was called into a room by somebody who was trying to sell that house. And the reason people were not buying the house was that in the house there were people speaking and people engaging in all kinds of discussions. And he, studied the house, spent time there day and night and so on. And he found the people who were the voices that were going on in the room. They were a young couple who had moved away to a different house, but they were still alive. And people in the house were hearing conversations they had or they had had before, but they were not dead. They were not ghosts at all. They were just flesh and bones people. Okay, so and this is San Francisco today, and we have lots of haunted houses, as you know, close to here. And of course, beyond death, the information we get is very different from the information we have at death or before death. So I think that's a useful definition. Now, in the meantime, parapsychology has moved on in parallel to studies of death and studies of communication beyond death. And now we have manifestations of parapsychological phenomena at a distance among people who may or may not be dead. So I think we have to look at that, because what if the communication, you see your grandmother, and your grandmother says that you should be careful when you're driving today, and you drive today and you have an accident. Well, maybe it was your subconscious telling you that and then manifesting your grandmother as a way to get your attention. Because if it's not manifested by someone you know, you're not going to pay attention to the message. And we know that our consciousness can anticipate the future, can see that you're going to have an accident this afternoon, and is in some ways trying to warn you by manifesting. So there was in the Bigelow board, the board of NIDS, not BAS. NIDS was in many ways more interesting. There was a general, an Air Force general, who specialized in instrumentation, especially the effect of high acceleration, under essentially also under combat conditions for young pilots in fighters, in fighter jets, where they need to make drastic maneuvers and so on, and they lose consciousness in those maneuvers. Now, when you put them in a centrifuge, which is what he was doing, you can make them lose consciousness also. And for a 19-year-old pilot, who wants to get into the jet, he doesn't believe that he's going to lose consciousness. And you can make him lose consciousness. And then you interrogate him about, what happened. Now, this general told us, he gave us a lecture about consciousness outside the body, including what he had experienced, because he was putting himself in the centrifuges, and he was asking to be sent to different speeds of rotation. And he had, in some cases, been outside his body, where he could see himself walking, and he was about 3 or 4 feet behind his body, walking down the hall. Okay, so when you study that at that level, you find that consciousness can be has many ways of being extracted outside of the body, and so where does it go when the body is no longer functioning? Can it still manifest? And that's he showed us some movies or some tapes of pilots in an F-18 that was diving to the ground because the pilot had gone unconscious. And when the pilot regained consciousness and could pull the jet out of the dive and survive, he was asking, what happened to you? And very often the pilot had a dream. One of them I remember very clearly, F-16 diving to the ground. The pilot had a dream that he was opening gifts. This was that his children had given him. Okay? It was very peaceful. And he was an NF-16 that was diving. So consciousness is, and at that point he was just, out of the ability to control anything around him. And when you talk to people who have been in those extreme conditions, that speaks to the domain of the phenomena you're describing, Leslie. And the question is, how do we discriminate about the physical conditions, and how do we know where? And that applies to abductions. People taken into a physical universe where they have no control. They may have. I remember speaking to the Hills, Betty and Barney Hills, and with the doctor who hypnotized them, and asking the doctor, what can you do with that? Where were they? And if and he said, I have no way of answering your question. And this was again someone who had studied hypnosis of people who had been at war and so on. He was in the army in World War II as a psychiatrist, using hypnosis. And so we now have to take all of that together and review it in new ways. And that's going to be very difficult. That's going, we're at the beginning of that.
An endless and ongoing process, Jacques, that will never end.
And books like yours are just, steps to that. And
Well, thank you very
I want
much.
to go back to Flammarion and extract the actual interviews that he did. Not all the theories around it that were still 19th century theories about ghosts and so on, but which are relevant. But I like the fact that manifestations of to the living, of the dying, the actual observing the process of that, and then revenant, the consciousness coming back.
Right. Sounds like fascinating books. I assume they're not translated into English, though, correct?
I have not found the English translations. There may have been at a time.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, we have time for one more question, so I think it's gonna be addressed to both of you. Let's do that one. Here it is for both of you. From Highstrangeness, from Toxictoy. Philip K. Dick was clearly inspired by Jacques Vallée's ideas when writing Vallis, and Jeffrey Kripal has explored both men's work deeply. How do you see Vallée's interdimensional hypothesis and control system theory influencing not just Vallis, I hope I'm saying that right, but the larger mystical psychological terrain that Philip K. Dick was navigating? Do you think Dick was having a genuine anomalous experience, or was he tuning into the same symbolic landscape Vallee describes? Also to Jacques, did you know about Philip K. Dick and his books at the time?
So yes, I did, and my answer to that is I think it was just in the air around Silicon Valley and around San Francisco and Berkeley at the time. I never met Philip Dick. He was just a few miles, north of here in Marin County. I think he probably, in the course of when he did, bumped into some of my books on some of my ideas. I, of course, knew about his work, both with movies and his science fiction. I was a great reader of American science fiction at the time. And but I think that there were many people in the area who were thinking and, arguing about that. Of course, SRI with Puthoff and Tag and the remote viewers, those conversations were current in the culture at the time. It was a fairly peculiar culture around San Francisco, but it was, it was brewing in many, many different ways. So I don't think there were, singling out me and him, but there were many other people. There was no ethics. There was all of that going on at the same time.
Jeff, do you want to say anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, Jacques and I have not had this conversation, but somebody like Eric Wargo does think that Vallis was somehow connected to Vallee, to Jacques. Dick had his metaphysical opening in February and March of 1974. That's when this inrush happened. And he was completely blown away by it. And Vallis stands for Vast Active Living Intelligence System. It was an acronym that Dick made up to describe this sort of cosmic mind that beamed into him in the winter of 74. And I do think I know for a fact, because of his journals called the Exegesis, which have since been, some of which have been published, he does relate it to SRI and to what's going on in the San Francisco area, but only later, only after the fact. So the question is really, how do we think about this influence? And Jacques' thoughts and reflections there, I think, are spot on. I think it's just very much part of the time as well. But there might be something deeper, something inspirational going on as well, which is really Eric's point. That they're not exclusive. Those models are not exclusive.
Thank you. Well, I guess we've been on for 2.5 hours. The time went really fast. You guys are both incredible, inspiring, brilliant human beings, and I'm just honored to be able to have been here with you today. I could listen to you a lot longer, but I think we have to call it a night. So thank you for being here and sharing what you've shared with everybody today.
It was an honor. It was an honor and a pleasure.
So great.
It's always an honor. Leslie, it's always an honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for putting this together and managing it.
Well, it wasn't very difficult with two guys like you. I want to thank all the Reddit community who are behind the scenes making this happen. There's probably 5 or 6 incredible people that make these things happen when we do them, and I'm grateful to them. And I guess it's just time to say goodnight. Everybody have a great weekend. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and to be continued at another time, I hope.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.